Thank you for finishing these up. There are not a lot of people sitting here, so I'm going to ask anybody sitting in the back.
How are we doing? Good? Good go? Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Edible Education 101. I'm Will Rosenzweig. Very happy to see all of you here this evening on another rainy night in Berkeley, California. How's everybody feeling tonight? I felt a little gloomy the last few days, kind of soggy. I live near the Russian River and it is rising. This was a photograph out my window the other day when the storm broke for a minute. But you know, when I start to lose faith, you know, today was kind of an unsettling day. Did anybody listen to the news today? It's a little unsettling about the people who run this country, but I won't digress into that. But tonight, we've got a very hopeful subject, and that's about seeds. Seeds of resistance and seeds of deliciousness. And we're going to bring you tonight really interesting sort of an investigative thriller from a very talented journalist and member of the faculty here at Berkeley, Mark Schapiro. And then we're going to feature the entrepreneurial exploits of a new company called Row 7. And Charlotte Douglas, who's a co-founder and COO of that company, is going to show you how entrepreneurial ingenuity is addressing some of the challenges. So really looking forward to the conversation tonight. But I thought I'd show you, when I get a little bit gloomy, I start thinking about seeds. This is my little friend Isaiah. He's 7. He came over the other day. We went into the greenhouse and he started planting. I think that there's something about developing an immediate relationship with your food that is completely transformative. When I was about his age, somebody gave me a rose bush to take care of. It completely changed my life. So Isaiah, he's got the seed packet in his hand there. He's carefully putting them in a 6-pack. I was kind of looking over his shoulder. He very carefully labeled the tags that says Super Sugar Snap on them. And then to the right, that other image is this morning. I've been sending him like time-lapse photographs each morning. But if you haven't ever planted a seed and grown something from seed, it's a life-changing experience because you develop a personal relationship with what's growing. You have to. You have to give it care. You have to give it attention. You have to make sure it stays just the right amount of dampness in there, that it gets enough light. You have to fend off the pests, and you watch it and you watch it. It's going to take like 67 days for that little seed to turn into a super sugar snap pea. And when you eat that pea, it's going to be like the best tasting pea you've ever had in your whole life because you grew it. So as we've talked about in this class, developing this kind of relationship as an enlightened eater, I think it all starts with seeds. And as Mark Schapiro says in the introduction to his book, seed is more than a seed. It's really a signal. And he is identifying that seeds are kind of the first responders in climate change. They're telling us what's changing and what's working and what's not working. And so it's really great finally to arrive after so many interesting classes around transparency and the farm as system. And last week, Danny Meyer's wonderful kind of presentation about equity and social justice in the restaurant and food service industry. We finally arrive at food security, really, and how important it is for us to be aware of the system of supply that is controlling, really, the essence of our vitality and well-being. So without further ado, I'd like a warm welcome for Mark Schapiro.
Thank you. Okay, well, listen, it's so great to be here at the center of kind of new thinking about food and about growing food. And you got to just show me how to use this, just so I make sure I know what the hell I'm doing. We're going through Thoreau. There goes Thoreau. Thoreau's moving aside to the left. There we go. Okay, so I'm just very happy to be here to bring us down to the essence of the seed, where it comes from, where all the food that you're talking about here comes from. I've got this picture up here, which I'm just going to let linger here for a while, because that is a picture of a grass that grows in Syria. And I'm just going to let that hang there, and I'll tell you the story about that grass a little later. For those who read chapter 1 of my book, which I distributed earlier, you will know that actually I've been following seeds in my own way for about 3 decades now. And about mid-'80s, Jesus, maybe it's even more, I went to a gene bank, Fort Collins, Colorado. I recommend it. Anybody goes there. First gene bank in America, run by the USDA. And I walked in there, probably about your age, or most of your age, and was completely blown away by seeing all these seeds lined up on these steel shelves in a very cold refrigerator on the campus of the University of Colorado State University. And it was the first time that I was introduced to the idea of genetic resources. These were called genetic resources. What the hell is a genetic resource? Well, guess what? It's a seed. And for the first time, I was introduced to this idea that these resources exist out there in the world, that seeds are genetic resources. And what does that mean? That means the seeds are the compilation of all the genes that have gone into those seeds in ways that they have responded in a call and response with the environment in which they grow. And at that time, the USDA thought that these were so precious and so important that they had to preserve them in this seed bank. And that was my first introduction. It was kind of a mind-opening experience. I wrote a couple stories about seeds back then, but I kind of left it behind, and I did a lot of other things in my life. I became an investigative journalist and wrote about every fun things like corruption and other environmental abuses. And several decades went by, and I realized, wow, I never forgot about those genetic resources, those seeds. And what was happening in the world, I noticed a number of different things that were converging. And those things were, on the one hand, climate change was profoundly changing the conditions on the Earth. And if you haven't read the studies or you haven't familiarized yourself with them, you're going to hit them every day from here on out. The record-breaking heat waves, the record-breaking intensity of events like storms, the droughts, et cetera, only accelerating. News delivered to us even by our own beleaguered scientific departments in the US government, as well as the IPCC and other places. So on the one hand, you have these enormous climatic shifts. And at the same time, you have this rapid consolidation of the seed industry. So at precisely the wrong time, not that there is ever a right time, but at probably hard to get a worse time, to watch the diminishment of genetic diversity. You have an increasing need for genetic diversity because of climate. And I want to talk about some of those themes because, but the main thing I want to also point out is I went through, this book took me a couple of years to write, as books tend to do. And I often ran into friends or peers or fellow colleagues, and I told them I was writing a book about seeds, and they'd all go, "Oh, you're writing a book about Monsanto, right?" And I hated getting that because it really, I was like, Monsanto is actually very late to the game. You know, they're about 10,000 years too late, or at least 10,000 years since the domestication of agriculture. And Monsanto has been involved in the seed business for maybe 45 years. Very new to the game, but the problem is that in the common understanding, people think seeds and they think Monsanto. And one of my goals in this book was to actually reclaim the idea of the seed. Don't let a company that's trying to monopolize the market hijack the very idea of what a seed is. And a seed, as you all know if you're in this class, is the source of all life and on the planet. And I found very moving how different people write about seeds, people think about seeds. Will had a great quote from Thoreau about the seed. My favorite, which I quote in the end of the book, you have to get all the way to the end of the book, but there it is. The great British playwright, George Bernard Shaw. People familiar with George Bernard Shaw? He's written a lot of famous plays. Pygmalion and a whole bunch of other ones. Major Barbara, anyway, I recommend George Bernard Shaw. Turn of the century, he's a great, go to your English lit class and you'll read George Bernard Shaw, I promise you. And, but he, this brilliant writer, actually had a word for seeds, and he talked about his awe at the fierce energy of a seed. Quote, seeds have a fierce energy. And I think that's something we have to remember all the time when we're talking about seeds. They have a fierce energy. You know how fierce that energy is, and hopefully you're in this class, edible education, you know what that means. But that means you've got this very tight little packet packed with information, usually has a very hard shell, and you add water, you add a little sunshine, you add a little mineral, and boom, that thing just flowers up. Well, it doesn't necessarily flower up, it expands, and it grows, and it breaks the surface of the earth, and it turns into a plant. And that plant, if you're looking, hopefully, you can eat the plant, but of course there are many plants that we don't eat, that other animals eat, and bugs and everything else eat. That is the fierce energy of a seed. So I want to kind of recapture the notion of what a seed is. So back to why this convergence, why when we talk about, so I want to keep that in mind as we talk about corporate consolidation, because it's very important we don't let the corporations that are consolidating in this area hijack our very idea of what a seed is. A seed is not a thing that is developed in a laboratory by Monsanto or any other company tinkering with something in a laboratory. That is a seed, but that shouldn't be your first association with a seed. A seed is a thing with a fierce energy that comes out of the earth and is packed with genetic information. As I was writing the book, I started thinking of seeds as containing stories. You know how you look at a tree ring? You look at a tree ring and you go like, oh, that's so cool. It's like one ring per year. And so you could actually go hundreds and hundreds of years. You can read a tree. And if you know what you're doing, if you know how to read a tree, you can see each one of those rings as telling you what the conditions were that the tree grew up in, whether it experienced fire, did it experience a disease, what were the temperature possibly of that period, what was embedded in the atmosphere that it was breathing. You can tell a huge amount from the rings in a tree. And seeds are just a lot smaller versions of of those trees. You can actually, if you slice open a seed and you know what you're doing, you could actually read what a seed is telling us. And it's telling us all about the conditions that seed is grown in, what kind of challenges it's faced. And so if we think of seeds as telling us stories, that's what I want us to be thinking about when we think about seeds. And this is going to become more and more relevant as we consider how do we respond to the climatic shifts that are occurring now. And first, I want to go into the challenge that we're facing, and then I want to go into why biodiversity is so important. And I actually, it's funny, when I started writing this book, I have a background as an investigative journalist, so I was going to investigate the seed companies, and I was going to figure out this whole process of corporate consolidation in the seed industry, which I did do. But then about midway through, I realized, oh my God, I'm actually writing a book about biodiversity, because that's why it matters. That's why this corporate consolidation, which I'll go into in a minute, that's why it matters, is the impact on, so what is biodiversity? Why is that important? And I finally ended up at the end of the book realizing that I'd written a book about ecology, because ecology, the ecological sciences, which are the ecology of farms, the ecology of agricultural areas, are what's at stake here in the big picture. So you have to understand, I realized I was writing a book about biodiversity, which is a part of the larger picture of ecology, which is the patterns, the interactions, the networks that exist in ecological systems that sustain life. And so, okay, so now we're going to go very quickly to, I want to get to the end of this thing very fast, and I'll go back to the beginning. So guess what? Here we go. This is a fun little graph here. In the let's try to understand, I'm going to come back to this question of biodiversity, but let's understand the context in which this is occurring. This is, aside from being a vaguely psychedelic, like, pattern wheel of circles and kind of oblong shapes, is a rendering of the seed industry as of 2018, done by this amazing agricultural social scientist named Philip Howard at the University of Michigan. He's the one guy who's done this. He's been tracking the consolidation of the seed industry over 30, 40 years. And he started actually in the 80s, but this is his latest, most recent thing. The reason I put this up is not because it's a beautiful image, but it does capture very powerfully what began happening in basically in the early 1990s. And when essentially, since the, let's say 1990 to today, close to 1,000 formerly independent seed companies were bought by larger companies. And because they realized they could actually patent a seed and market it. And so over the past 25 years, all of these here, little round circles, are kind of formerly local seed companies that have been consolidated in these kind of mega companies. In this case, it's Corteva, which is the focus group established name for Dow and DuPont. Everybody heard of Dow and DuPont? Dow, DuPont, huge chemical company, started a seed division. It's called Corteva. You can imagine them sitting around doing a focus group thing to get that, a bunch of soft letters. And then you have Bayer, which of course most of you know own Monsanto. Bayer was the biggest chemical company in Germany, now the owner of what was the biggest seed company in America. And the third major company that we're concerned with here is ChemChina, largest chemical company in China, which bought the largest seed company in Switzerland, which is called Syngenta. Those three huge seed companies, those three seed companies, now owned by chemical companies, dominate more than half of the global trade in seeds right now. And what again is their common thread? They're chemical companies. So remember, this is extremely important to remember. 3 chemical companies now dominate more than half of the global trade in seeds. And why is that important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons is that they have been breeding what I call crack baby seeds. Seeds that are essentially born addicted to chemicals to survive. And what's happened over and over and over again is that those local seed companies that they bought up ended up, each of those seed companies, just a quick rundown. This is actually going back 25, 30 years, and I'm sure Charlotte can address some of these in more detail. Each of those local seed companies produced seeds that were responsive to local conditions. You had a seed company in the Southeast, you had one in Sonoma County, you had another one in the upper Midwest, another one in the central Midwest, another one's in the panhandle of Texas. Each of these ecological zones developing seeds that were responsive to those conditions. When those local seed companies were purchased, those seeds were taken off the market and replaced with these blockbuster seeds that were completely dependent on chemicals to survive. So what the genetic information that seeds used to have ingrained in their genetic material was replaced by chemicals to sustain those seeds. And that's why this is an important development. Now, hold on here. Let me go backwards. How do I go backwards? Okay. I want to get back to, how do I go backwards, Will? This thing, I've never used this thing. Is that this?
You turn it around the other way.
Okay, let's turn it around the other way. There we go. Okay, we're just going to go back. I just want to hang there on that grass again. Okay, so basically there. We're back to our Syrian grass. So basically, that is the situation. And every study that's been done, and I cite them in my book, and you have probably come upon them, study after study after study by some of the top agro-science institutions in America and in the world, has shown a steady shrinkage of genetic diversity across America that correlates almost perfectly with the consolidation of the seed industry over the last 40 years. And I have citations in my book. You can find graphs, you can find maps, but just essentially the graphs tell you the story that as the number of seed companies shrank over the course of 2.5 decades, the diverse varieties of crops planted in the fields steadily shrank at the same time, which means we're planting more and more of the same types of seeds with the same kind of vulnerabilities that have a need for ever larger quantities of chemicals. And so the question really is, why does that matter? I mean, it may be kind of a disquieting thought, but why does it actually matter, aside from the public health consequences of applying chemicals, which itself is an issue? But why does that matter from the point of view of a planet that's going through increasing levels of ecological stress as a result of climatic shifts? And to address that question, I'm going to start telling you a story about this blade of grass. So this blade of grass, anybody tell what this blade of grass is? It grows in Syria and around the Middle East. Okay, you can't, it's that. It's called the Agapolis tauchi. I had to learn that. I'd never heard of this before. It's some kind of thing in some Latin scientific phrase, but it's a very important grass, I learned. I had to get the plant scientist I talked to about this to repeat it to me 4 times to figure out I was actually hearing the right thing. But there it is, the Agapolis tauchi, and the Agapolis tauchi has a lot to tell us. And it grows wild in the fields of Syria and all over the Middle East. And it also grows here. So do you happen to remember, in 2003 when American troops massed on the border with Kuwait. Yeah, and what did they do? They invaded Iraq in 2003. And do you happen to remember a city called Abu Ghraib? Well, horrible things happened to by American soldiers to Iraqi prisoners. Infamous, grotesque. Well, it turns out there was also a seed bank in Abu Ghraib. And look at the location of where Abu Ghraib, you see the red name? Where is Abu Ghraib? Abu Ghraib is right in the middle between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And you remember from like Geography 101, where are the Tigris-Euphrates rivers? The Fertile Crescent. This is, of course, I'm sure this is all coming back to you with your geography class. That is the Fertile Crescent. Abu Ghraib is smack dab in the middle of the Fertile Crescent, and in Abu Ghraib was a very important seed bank that had been standing for several decades. And in that seed bank, they collected wheats and barleys and peas and all sorts of crops that are endemic to the Middle East, to Iraq and the Middle East. And even under Saddam, scientists used to come and visit and study those seeds. It was a thriving center of inquiry and research. And then 2003, the American troops are roaring on into Iraq. And yes, you could tell a random bomb drops, decimates the seed bank that's in the middle of Abu Ghraib. And what happened next? It was a very, I talked to farmers who actually used those seeds. They collected them, they planted widely all across Iraq and Syria. The bomb dropped, destroyed the seed bank. A bunch of Iraqi and Italian scientists rushed into the seed bank, collected what they could off the floor, and raced those seeds from Abu Ghraib across the border to here. Here is Syria, of course. And if you look up at there's Iraq. They took those seeds all the way across Syria to western Syria to the city of Aleppo. And about 20 miles outside of Aleppo was another incredible seed bank, even larger seed bank in Aleppo. And this seed bank was run by the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas. It's a very long thing, but if you don't remember anything about their name, remember dry areas. So it's International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas. We'll call them ICARDA. But the most important two words in the title of this seed bank, which is part of a network of UN-run seed banks, is dry areas. Why? Because increasing parts of the earth are starting to become dry areas. So these seed banks, particularly this one outside of Aleppo, about 20 miles outside of Aleppo, scientists raced the Iraqi seeds across the border, made it to the seed bank, and that was by 2004. So those seeds had a nice dozen years or so in Syria until, and actually became, the seed bank was really interesting. I talked to people who worked there, and it had become a center for the rebels all around that area. I don't know if you remember, if you followed the horrible Syrian war, but one of the strongest redoubts of the rebels was in and around Aleppo. And the rebels took over this seed bank and agreed to protect it. They agreed to protect because the rebel commander was a farmer, and he knew exactly how important these seeds were. And he agreed to provide diesel to keep the refrigerator running, to keep the electricity running, in return for, if they grew some food, that they would allow the rebels to eat the food. So they enabled the seed bank to keep running for a couple of years until the barrel bombs started dropping. This is a picture of the inside of that seed bank, which was actually in Syria. And those bombs came, decimated the seed bank, electricity was lost, and once again, they raced the seeds across the border to Lebanon. And those seeds are now being regrown in the eastern part of Lebanon. Some of you might be familiar with the Bekaa Valley. the Bekaa Valley, very lush, fertile area. That's where those seeds are being grown now. And run, by the way, by Hezbollah, which has agreed to protect them. So I'm still hoping to get over there myself. I haven't made it to there, but I did. It's a very interesting place, and this man runs it, Ahmed Amri. He greeted the seeds on the other end. This is what it looks like inside. And why we want to know about these seeds is because they've ended up traversing and being sent all over the world, these very important dry area seeds. And one of the places they've been sent is right here, Kansas, USA. And right in the middle of Kansas, they've been having a very stressful conditions. The temperatures have been rising at a rapid rate. This is actually from NOAA, which actually shows us essentially, without going into all the details, that the temperatures over the past decade or so have deviated from the mean of the previous century by more than 2 degrees. It's getting hotter and hotter and hotter in Kansas as it is all the way throughout the Midwest. So what is the result of that situation? Talk about climate stress. You get this. So all sorts of diseases, fungi, new bacteria are showing up because they're following the heat. And one of the bugs that's actually been following the heat is the Hessian fruit fly, which is that little beast. So if you think about climate change, I think it's super important to think on multiple levels at the same time. The Midwest, our own Midwest here in the United States, parts of the Midwest are starting to resemble the Middle East. And that is hugely significant in terms of not only that this phenomenon is happening, but how do we respond to that? What are the seeds that we're going to need to respond to that? And that's what they've been trying to figure out in Kansas. And one of the major things a bunch of scientists did in Kansas State University, because the yields have been dropping steadily on American wheat, by the way, due to this infestation. By the way, the larva of the fruit fly used to be killed when it got cold. So it would get cold, and that would kill the larva, so it wasn't a problem. But now it's warmer longer, which means the larvae actually hatch. When they hatch, they go and devour wheat leaves. And you can go all across Kansas and see, and the whole wheat belt of America. You can go to Colorado, Oklahoma, northern Texas, Nebraska, being devastated by this bug right here, which is this is like a moniker for climate change. If you're looking for images of climate change, they're all over the place. One of them is that bug, and the other of them is that grass. So they did all these studies. They set up a hothouse in Kansas. They brought in all these dozens of different kind of wheat varieties, wheat grass seedlings. They planted them in a hothouse, unleashed a horde of Hessian flies to see what would happen. And the seed that survived the Hessian flies was that wheat grass from Syria. And that wheatgrass was shown to be incredibly resilient to and resistant seeds of resistance. There's multiple entendres in that title. Was resistant to the Hessian fly. It built up that resistance over many, 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 many years, evolving in the Middle East. Now the Midwest is starting to resemble the Middle East, and that plant is starting to be bred into the American wheat crop right now. So in many ways, the American wheat crop is going to be saved by a Syrian seed. And they also found out that actually this seed, not only is it resistant to the fruit fly, but to many other things. And I looked these up. This is the great stuff you get to do when you're a journalist. You know, they look like underground rock bands, but these are diseases that Agapolis tauchi is resistant to. So dig it. You can go to barley yellow dwarf. I'm sure they're playing on Treasure Island, in a couple of weeks. Mosaic virus, wheat rust, and of course the fruit fly. This amazing grass. So if there's nothing else, and now it's being grown all over the place, now they're trying to breed it all over the place in the Midwest. And the important lesson about this grass is actually that the biodiversity that people weren't thinking about in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world is critical if we are going to adapt to these climatic changes. And what's clear, and I think Charlotte will deal with this on a more profound and closer to the ground level perhaps, what's clear in study after study after study that biodiverse fields, more organically rich soil, survive much better the extremes of climatic stress. And this is what's happening more and more. That story of the wheatgrass is multiplied by hundreds. And I'm sure Charlotte's been in the middle of some versions of this story. And to wrap things up, I just want to tell you that I was so immersed in seeds, I started thinking, what do seeds remind me of? What is it? How do I communicate the vitality and the vibrancy of seed, of introductions of different seeds, the importance of biodiversity? And I thought, well, it's actually kind of like music. And for any of you who actually listen to different varieties of music, you will note that basically musicians they come from all over the world, and they play together, and they influence each other. And my favorite happens to be Ali Farkature with Ry Cooder. I don't know if anybody knows these guys, but it's a fantastic record. And it is all about, if you think about seeds, think of this record. You may or may not like it. I happen to love it. Ali Farkature is an amazing Malian musician from Mali. Incredible music coming out of the deserts of Mali. And Ry Cooder, of course, is a fantastic American blues guitarist. These two people came together and made an album of a combination of African music from the northern deserts of Africa with the deep blues of Ry Cooder. And first of all, it's a great record. But secondly, more important for our purposes, this is when two people infused with the internal lives of their own musical cultures came together and made a new musical culture out of this kind of meeting of the ways. And that's what I think is important to keep in mind when we start thinking about seeds in this era. And with that, I can imagine that Charlotte is going to be able to carry us through much more closely to the ground. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Excellent. I'm going to skip ahead on your slides a couple. Thank you, Mark. My Thoreau quote was, I have great faith in a seed. Convince me you have a seed there, and I will expect wonders. I have great faith in a seed. So a year or so ago, I had the pleasure of watching the birth of a new business. About a year ago, we had Chef Dan Barber here, and he shared with us his philosophy and vision of the third plate, and introduced us to some of the vegetables that he was mad about. But he hadn't announced the birth of this new venture that he's been involved in, and had the great pleasure to get to know Charlotte Douglas, who's been a co-founder of Row 7 Seeds. So we thought we'd give you a more practical application of how a startup company is dealing in the world of seeds and actually creating a whole ecosystem of innovation. So all the way from New York, just to be here with you tonight, is Charlotte Douglas. Warm round of applause for Charlotte. That's your background.
Thank you. So thank you to Will for having me, and thank you, Mark. Row 7 is actually exactly 1 year old today. So thank you. Exactly. It's perfectly timed. But it's wonderful to be here as kind of part of that celebration. And we are an organic seed company that was co-founded by, I feel I'm going through the same, okay. Co-founded by Dan Barber, the chef of Blue Hill in New York, Michael Mazurek, who is an organic plant breeder, and Matthew Goldfarb, an organic seed producer. And our mission is to take pretty much everything that Mark just described about our modern, consolidated, chemical-driven seed industry and turn it right side up. We bring chefs and plant breeders and growers together to create new diversity, to develop and release new varieties of vegetables and grains that are bred for flavor and for organic systems. So it says up here to make an impact in the soil and at the table, and I think that that phrase contains sort of two central challenges to this work, which is one, how do you develop and support the development of new diversity that is going to improve our diets and our landscapes? And two, how do you activate the potential of that diversity in the market and in the food system? So I am going to try to begin to answer those questions today. I think they are lifelong. But I want to start with a broader conversation that Mark began about biodiversity and about seeds. And we do tend to think about seeds these days in terms of loss, in terms of this narrowing of genetic resources. And I think that your book does an extraordinary job of establishing the stakes of that conversation. But there's also a vein of optimism in this work, which is that humans also have potential to bring an enormous amount of diversity into the world. And a lot of the diversity that we're trying to steward and to protect today is the result of thousands of years of human intervention in nature. So here is an example. This is Brassica oleracea, otherwise known as wild cabbage. And you've probably never seen it in this form, but 2,500 years ago, this plant was thriving along the coastlines of Europe. And then something happened, which is that humans started to cultivate this plant on purpose. So they saved seeds from generation to generation. And as they were saving the seeds, they began to select and save seeds from plants that expressed particular traits. So in ancient Greece, you had people selecting for more abundant and delicious leaves. And in Northern Europe, you had people selecting for kind of thicker and more cold hardy stems. And you fast forward, many, many iterations of this and hundreds of years, and this is the result. This kind of explosion of diversity, all adapted to different environments and to different culinary applications, derived from this one wild species. So this is, I think it's incredible and mind-blowing. I hope you do too. We are totally unique in our ability to negotiate with plants in this way. And this is something that in the past 200 years we have refined into a science. So you have plant breeders making intentional crosses between plants and selecting for very specific outcomes. So it's basically a kind of recipe. You're deciding from the seed what a plant is going to look like and taste like, and how it's performing in the field, and how it's functioning in a cuisine and in a culture. So plant breeders are creating the blueprints for our food system. And I love a platform of plant nerdy empowerment, but I'm going to step off of it for a moment and just say that in the past 10,000 years, this system has, this 10,000-year-old system has really been turned on its head. So as Mark shared, our seeds, these blueprints for our food system, are increasingly in the hands of a few chemical companies who are driving not just toward monoculture and mass distribution and a system of sameness, but also a system of chemical inputs. So we have this disconnect in our food system between people who are increasingly demanding food that is delicious and nutritious and diverse, and recognizing that those things should be accessible to everyone. And you have growers who are trying to add diversity and value and resilience to their farms in the face of a changing climate. And you have a seed industry represented here that is less and less incentivized to deliver those things. So Row 7 took root about actually 9 years ago when Dan Barber and Michael Mazurek first met. And I was working with Dan at Blue Hill at the time and was actually kind of there for this fateful first meeting. And Dan brought Michael into the kitchen where Michael was sharing about his squash breeding program at Cornell University. And at some point during this conversation, Dan pointed to a cook in the corner who was prepping butternut squash. And he said something to the effect of, if you're such a great breeder, why can't you make that taste good? And I think that, I mean, he was definitely half joking, but there was a seed of a real challenge there, which is, do we really have to add all of the things that we add to butternut squash to make it taste delicious? You know, is this the best that we can do? And Michael's response is something that is kind of the origin story for this company and also something that haunts us to this day, which is that he said, in my years of plant breeding, nobody has ever asked me to breed for flavor. So it is hard to kind of overstate the scale of that light bulb moment. You have, on the one hand, a chef who is, you know, obsessively farm to table and thinking all the time about the forces in the fields and in the soil that contribute to an ingredient's quality. And I think what he realized in that moment is that in order to really engage with that recipe and fulfill its potential, you have to dial it back to the seed. And not just to the seed, but to the architects of those seed, the people who are making those decisions. And then you had Michael, who was a young and creative plant breeder who was actually incredibly passionate about flavor. And what he shared was that the directive for him and most plant breeders was to breed for yield and uniformity and shelf life and conventional qualities in every sense of the word. Anything that did not meet these specific industry standards wasn't valued in the system. So that one conversation launched years of experimentation with the chefs at the restaurant collaborating with Michael and other plant breeders and other farmers to really trial and co-select new varieties in the field and in the kitchen, looking at what was thriving in both places. And as we saw with the Brassica example, this is not a new idea. This is how things have worked for thousands of years, this kind of negotiation of what is productive and what is delicious. But I wanted to share a few examples of how that looks in a modern context and some of the work that we were doing. So this is the Badger Flame beet. And it was developed by a man named Erwin Goldman at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And Erwin is very brilliant, and he's very passionate about focusing people's attention on vegetables. So in this case, he wanted to create this visually stunning beet. If you cut into it, it looks like this flaming torch. But he also wanted to redefine how we think about beet flavor. So we saw Erwin recently, and he was telling this story about how when he was younger, he used to bring his children into the field with him to kind of nourish them with his work and with the fruits of his labor. So he would cut off pieces of raw beet and feed them to his kids. And this was supposed to be a really loving moment, and I wrote down what they said. Hold on. They told him, this is like licking a playground. It's like eating mud. And that is harsh, but true. Beets do have this signature earthy aroma, and it's caused by a compound called geosmin. So if you think about the smell that the soil releases after the rain, that is geosmin, and it's produced primarily by microbes in the soil. So scientists have known for years that geosmin is also present in beets, but they didn't understand why or how. They didn't know if it was inherent to the beet or if it was through some negotiation with the soil and some interaction. So Erwin set off on this quest for beet enlightenment, and he grew out many, many cultivars of beets in a very controlled environment. And what he proved over the years was that not only were the roots themselves producing the geosmin, but that different cultivars, different varieties of beets had different levels of geosmin. So from that, he knew that through selective breeding, he could sort of dial this up or dial this down in the plant. And that's what he did. He started to select for a low geosmin beet, and he shared it with the kitchen. And Dan was the most receptive audience because I think they first had a conversation about this beet in like mid-January, which is when anti-beet sentiment is sort of at its peak in the restaurant. And so Dan was viewing this as this gateway beet for the future. And it is, it is that a little bit. It is incredibly delicious and sweet and mild, and you can eat it raw. I have a 5-year-old daughter who, despite my best efforts, is also vehemently anti-beet, but she eats these like carrots. She will just like snack into them. So that is one example of breeding for flavor that is measurable, it is informed by modern science. This is a very different example, and it's one that's more about that ongoing conversation between field and kitchen. So this conversation began many years ago in the field, and we were walking through rows of delicata squash plants. And it was October, and the frost was approaching, but we noticed that on the vines there were still these small, immature green squash. So we asked the farmer what was going to happen to them, and he said, this is pretty typical. In the Northeast, he has one winter squash harvest day, and any squash that isn't large enough or isn't going to mature in time for the frost just gets left on the vine to rot. So maybe a quarter of the plants on the vine go to waste. So Dan and Blue Hill, we were in the middle of this food waste initiative at the time and obsessed with finding culinary value in what gets left behind. So of course, Dan takes the squash off the vine and just bites into it, the raw squash. And it turns out these little ones in the corner, they are very delicious. They taste like maybe a better summer squash. They have this delicate crunch, and the best ones are sweet and floral. So what if you could breed for that kind of delicata squash? Well, you can, and Michael Mazurek did it. He began to cross multiple delicata plants and select for a dual-purpose crop where you were evaluating them both in the immature phase and in the mature phase as a winter squash. And then we didn't stop at the squash because Dan was now, again, thinking about all of this wasted potential squash biomass. So we asked the farmer to harvest the stems of this plant. And they were hollow, and they looked sort of penne in diameter. So he created this squash stem pasta dish, and Michael, in turn, incorporated that into his selection criteria in his program. So he was selecting for spineless and less fibrous stems. So this is the result. It's this almost zero waste, but a multi-purpose delicata that was bred to create a new culture around eating squash, which is about kind of stem to fruit, but then also to create a new economy and a new market for the grower. So this is the last example that I'll show, and it's going back to that question and that challenge of Dan's of can you build a better butternut? And you can. This is it on the right. It's the honey nut squash. I don't know, you may have heard of it. But it manages to concentrate all of the sweetness and the dry matter of a butternut into this very adorable handheld package. And in the process, it also concentrates the nutrition. So this honey nut has 3 times the carotenoids of a butternut, and one serving contains, I think, more than double the recommended dietary allowance of vitamin A. So it is a remarkable squash. And what I think is most remarkable is that when Michael went to release this squash several years ago, there was very little interest from seed companies or farmers or the industry because there is no market for this kind of squash. There's no SKU for this. And if you're going by conventional standards where you're measuring yield in terms of field weight and tonnage as opposed to nutritional yield per acre or flavor, then this just looks like a little runty. So it's a squash that would have gone nowhere except for the fact that Dan and chefs tasted it and became just advocates for it. They started advertising it on their menus and celebrating it in the press and talking about it at the market. And almost overnight, this kind of gained traction. So today, this squash is pretty ubiquitous. If you go to any farmer's market around the country, you will find someone almost certainly growing this squash. And it's available in Trader Joe's and Wegmans. And Blue Apron has harvested millions of pounds over the past few years. It is, it has permeated our everyday food culture. So I think seeing this unfold over the past several years, I think what we realized is that this participatory model actually had incredible potential, because it was creating, on the one hand, an engine for innovation and discovery and kind of bringing out all of this diversity that had been, we didn't have access to before. And then also through the chef's platform, you had this new opportunity for storytelling. So we saw how the chef's voice, in the case of the Honey Nut, could create a market for this diversity outside of the walls of a white tablecloth restaurant, how you could bring it into the mainstream. So with Row 7, we saw an opportunity to really kind of formalize that work. And we launched last year with 7 varieties of vegetables, all the product of this chef and breeder collaboration. And we created a website to sell organic seeds to growers and gardeners. We were really deliberate in being streamlined about the portfolio or the catalog. If you think about most modern seed catalogs, they are encyclopedic, because we wanted to do that kind of storytelling, and we wanted to participate in creating that support and that traction in the market. And here's the first way that we did that. This is the map of chefs that we reached out to before launching last year. And we were looking for chefs who represented different regions in the US and beyond, and who had a diversity of perspectives and were working in different cuisines. But we also wanted to work with chefs who had a really deep relationship with at least one grower. We knew that there had to be a farmer signed on to this project, because that field and kitchen feedback loop is really essential to this work. So in February of last year, we sent out seeds to all of these chefs and their growers. And the understanding was that the growers were going to plant the seeds and provide their observations throughout the season. So planting dates, harvest dates, pest and disease pressure, yields. And then the chefs, in turn, were going to experiment with the produce in the kitchen and provide their feedback. So here's a kind of small subsection of that community. And what we found is that through their feedback, we were able to see how these different varieties were adapting to different regions and different soils and different culinary techniques. And we also saw where they weren't adapting, where they weren't working, and so where there was need for future breeding work and opportunity. We also sent out varieties that were still in development. So this is a purple pea that we were trialing last year. And again, we were looking for that field and kitchen feedback. So how is this pea holding up in different temperatures and in different climates? But this pea was also bred for this specific trait. Michael Mazurek bred this to hold its purple color in cooking, which is something that is unique among purple peas. So here was this opportunity to stress test this across many different environments and culinary techniques. So this participatory process is what decides what comes into our catalog moving forward. And it's also creating this pipeline of new projects. So we're trying to replicate this model all over the country. This is a project that is in your neck of the woods. It's up in Sonoma right now, and it's in collaboration with Single Thread Farm and with a breeder named Kevin Murphy. And Kevin is a barley breeder, and so this is a culinary barley project. And I'm gonna kind of borrow a move from his playbook right now and just poll the room as to who has eaten barley in the last year. Wow, you guys. It's Berkeley, it's really incredible. Well, that barley it was almost definitely bred for pigs. So what Kevin Murphy has taught us is that modern barley is bred for two purposes. It's bred for animal feed, and it's bred for beer, for malting. So you may have gotten a failed malting variety. But there has been really no work in a modern context around flavor or nutrition in this grain. So that's the objective here. It's how do you add culinary and nutritional value to what is essentially a commodity crop? And in the process, how do you create a market for this incredible soil-building grain that adds value to organic systems? So this model is not without its challenges. It requires an enormous amount of community organizing, and I think that's most of what we've been doing for this past year. But the response has been really overwhelming, and chefs almost immediately began kind of naming these ingredients on their menus and celebrating them on social media and in the press, not because we had asked them to, but because they have become kind of co-owners of this work and of this story. And 1 year in, I think we're seeing that same viral effect that we saw with the honey nut squash. So we're seeing the acceleration of the traction in the market for these individual varieties, which is amazing, but more importantly, we're seeing this shift in food culture and in conversation toward seeds and seed to table. So a big question is, how do we keep helping with that culture shift, and how do we create more scale and access to that work? And we want to approach that in the same kind of collaborative way. So these are a few images from a partnership that we launched last year with Sweetgreen. And it launched in November, but was many months in the making. So before we were even row 7, they had purchased 100,000 seeds of the coconut squash, this new squash bred for organic systems. And they shared it with 6 of their growers around the country. And in the fall, they harvested a little over 23 acres of the squash. So the coconut was featured on all of their menus across 90 stores, or 89 stores. And in 1 year, they kind of scaled and created a supply chain for a variety that they had never worked with before. I think what's most valuable or most exciting about this was that it also created, again, this kind of platform for storytelling on the menus and in the store windows and on taxi tops and this Times Square billboard. Through this story about the squash and about flavor, we introduced a conversation about breeding into people's everyday food choices. So, I started with these 2 questions of how do you create diversity for the future, and also how do you create demand for that diversity? And I'm going to add one more question, which is looking back actually to that seed consolidation chart that we were showing earlier. And I think I come away with from that chart with this question of how do you re-empower people? How do you re-empower farmers and cooks and eaters and everyone in this room as stakeholders in that system? And I think that's another way to think about the mission of this work. I got into working with food over a decade ago because I think, like many of you, I wanted to see change in the food system. And Blue Hill was an amazing activation and education in those ideas. I got to see many different facets of the food movement. So issues of soil health and climate change and nutrition and food waste and food access and politics. And I think the more I came to appreciate all the complexities of this system, the more I see that they share a common denominator, which is, eventually all of our work around food and all of our potential for improvement and change dials back to the seed and to the blueprints that we're writing. So I think that is the challenge, and the question that I would leave you with today is just, as you navigate your own way in this space, how do you take all of these different conversations and make sure that you're dialing them back to that point of origin? And then also, how do you become a participant in the improvement of those seeds and the evolution of our food? And what I love, and I think Will referenced this earlier, is that there is a really simple and tangible way to do that, and that is just to plant a seed. I think 1 year into this work, I'm more hopeful than ever because I see the radical potential of just that one action. So I will leave you there, but thank you again, and excited to continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Great.
You want to come over and sit? Mark, you want to come over and join us? Quick reminder, your first paper's due next week. Everybody remember that? Just in case you weren't paying attention. And the teaching team would love to hear from you if you have a question this week, but not next week, which is the week it's due. We've been hearing from some of you, and we're really excited about the topics you're choosing. Well, what I'm happy about is that it's happy birthday, row 7, and that I don't know if we exactly planned that, but I was really happy that we could get you both here on the same evening. Very
that was so kind.
Complimentary, and you did all the flying in that storm. But,
happy birthday.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What I love, so as many of you know, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm kind of a gardener at heart, but an entrepreneur by practice. And I love the idea that a new startup thinks about marketing as community organizing. I think that that's really salient here in the transformation of the food system. And the other thing that I really appreciate is how much attention you're paying. You use the word storytelling, Charlotte, but you're really creating a narrative that I think people can become a part of and identify with and own. Right. And you've both sort of set up that there's pretty powerful competing paradigms and narratives going on right now. And the one that's summarized by Phil Howard's chart is one that's sort of associated with the story that, hey, there's soon going to be 9 billion people on the planet, and the only way we're ever going to feed those is through an industrial system that's dependent on this kind of predictable, high yield systems that farmers can really count on. And both of you, I think, in your work have really come to make us appreciate the dance of biodiversity. Maybe you could each talk a little bit, and then we'll have some questions from the audience, so think about those. But talk a little bit maybe about your views on those competing paradigms. You know, one of the things we've learned a couple weeks ago, we had a class on the Farm Bill, and it became abundantly clear that the way the resources were allocated to certain approaches to, growing commodity crops, that the flow of that money was also creating enormous resources to, for lack of a better word, promote the narrative of the value of that approach, and that, tiny little sliver was getting over to organic and regenerative, but more than the last Farm Bill. But still, so what I love is this, how you're creating a new narrative, but let's also keep in mind that you're doing that in the face of enormous counter-narrative.
Well, that is a fantastic way to set this up. Yeah, I think as I was writing this and I got deep into the research and such, it just seemed like we are at this very critical moment now when the paradigm that was established to justify industrial agriculture is being challenged. And it's being challenged on so many different levels. First of all, it's being challenged by the ecological conditions on the planet itself. Climate change is actually shining an enormous light on the vulnerabilities of industrial agriculture, because you can't number one, the yields are dropping in those fields. And what's also interesting is that the pace of change is accelerating so quickly that the traditional model that industrial seed companies have to breed seeds and over time to respond to changing weather or whatever it is, the changes are going too quickly. And so in a sense, the changes are outpacing the ability of the seed companies to develop seeds, even with all the chemicals and all the other stuff. So there was this paradigm, by the way, has been built on a number of things. Number one, an enormous sort of manipulation of scientific evidence, which is a huge story, but we don't have to go into all the details now. But and also the proliferation of this idea that at every turn we have to maximize production at every turn possible in order to feed the hungry, starving hordes. And it's very crude. It's like there's always a starving African. I don't mean it in I find that a deeply insulting phrase, but it's so common now that there's always there's kind of a quote starving African behind every discussion about how we're going to grow food. And that is a deep myth that's just grounded in the way people approach that supported this paradigm, because the amount of hungry people in the world bears no relationship to the quantity of food being produced. And you have enormous hunger in the midst of abundant plenty. And you don't even have to go that far. You don't have to go to a starving African. You can go to a starving farm worker in the Central Valley, where they have serious hunger issues amidst all that bounty. So once we eliminate that myth, and there's a huge amount of evidence, I write about it, I'm sure you've come upon it, there's a lot of literature about how deeply mythological that assumption is. Then you can start thinking about an agriculture that is less destructive to the environment, to the earth. And that is where we are now, where you have fantastic things like your farm and many other farms are actually beginning to show us that you can actually grow food in less ecologically destructive ways. And so that paradigm is right now being challenged in ways that I think
so you're basically telling us that this is a moment in time where there's an inflection point, there's a leverage point. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so exciting now about the timing of row 7. Mm-hmm. And the story you told, Charlotte, is really instructive for any future entrepreneurs in the class, because if you listen carefully, you heard, remember when I started the class the first week and I told you about that cycle that had serendipity in it? And so the origin story of this company starts with that serendipitous moment, which was sort of a challenge that Dan had for the breeder, like, well, why can't you do this?
Right.
And then there was there's all those iterations, which is what we realize entrepreneurs do, is that they take action, they learn quickly, and then they iterate. And so your challenge is just so interesting. You've got this, you don't have just one customer, you have to really bring this whole ecosystem around. So talk, if you feel like it, talk a little bit more like, you guys are masterful already at the storytelling of not just, you're telling the story to us without even serving us the food. I actually ate that penne, the penne squash, which was just unbelievable. That was like life-changing. So, wow. But talk to us a little bit from a business perspective. How are you experimenting, and what are you learning quickly, and your birthday.
On my birthday. I think to your previous point too, I think where we've seen a gap is really in the research. And so I think a lot of our work comes down to how can we shift the incentives and investment toward organic plant breeding research and toward varieties that are going to thrive in this new ecological system. Because that is really where we see food going. And so, I think we need to support that with research right now. And it's a big piece of what we think about. And to your question about what have we learned, it feels like this first year has just been full of learning. And I think one of them is that we realized early on that we couldn't take a traditional model in terms of a seed company, which tends to transact purely with the grower. And to your point, I think, how do we create an ecosystem here and engage with other stakeholders in the system? That's really what we've tried to build, where it's not just the chefs, but also how are you looking at, retailers and distributors and food companies as kind of potential allies and partners in this movement and in this mission, all to bring better food to the end consumer. So I think in the stories we tell, we are speaking simultaneously to the growers and trying to share, a value proposition with them, but also trying to kind of shift the storytelling that's happening for just the everyday eater. So it is a challenge, but I think what's wonderful is that seeds do contain all of these stories. They are not commodities as they're kind of treated today in the system. So I think that's a big piece of what we're
It's a really different business model. I mean, at the end of the day, obviously, to keep the lights on, you're looking at how many seeds you sell, but effectively you're measuring a whole different set of metrics that are indicators of success, because it's really business as movement now. It's not just business as product to a single customer and trying to scale that up. But what's interesting to me is, I was thinking about this as in preparing today. I was thinking about, if you could set the lens not for how are you doing next year at this time, but how are you doing in 20 years? And would the people in this room and the people who are at home watching this class, participating in this, say, I actually made a conscious choice to participate in a different system, in a different paradigm, and I'm going to seek out food that perhaps is grown this way. I'm going to appreciate the true cost of that food, from the quality of the soil to the health care cost to the nutritional value, and to actively participate in that. So, like, one of our goals in this class is to, become enlightened eaters, and then also to learn how to take action. So I was going to just make an offer too of, if anyone would like any seeds, I actually have some from row 7. If you send me a note this week, I'll bring you some next week, and you can plant them, and maybe, I don't know, by spring we could have, well, almost, maybe when in the early summer we can have a big potluck. Maybe Dan will come out and cook it. Yeah, for sure.
You could do guerrilla plantings. Just drop them in key places. If
Is
you don't have a
Mary?
yard.
Yeah, Mary McGrail here? Mary, are you here tonight? Mary? No? Okay, maybe the rain. Are you just being shy? No. I'll read your question. This is a great question from Mary. In the excerpt we read from Dan Barber's The Third Plate, he said, the sweeping legislation of 1862 created a feedback loop of experimentation and learning for farmers in every part of the country, which led to increased harvest yields and lowered prices. This reminded me of Donella Meadows' piece on systems thinking we read in the first week, which encourages us to make feedback policies for feedback systems. But the land grant program, which was considered successful for 100 years, also came with foreclosures, consolidation, and with great environmental destruction. I'm curious, where do you think we failed policy-wise with this once effective feedback loop? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, I'll throw in my 2 cents, and then you're much closer to the ground, Charlotte, in a way. I mean, in a way, we started losing that sense, I think, going back to the 50s and 60s, actually, and there's kind of no, I mean, it's basically, you could actually see as Americans
lost touch with the sources of their food in a lot of ways and started moving away from rural areas, 50s and 60s, is when this kind of idea that you could manipulate the environment to in other words, I interviewed an executive at Monsanto, and my question to her, and it was very revealing, and I think gets to this question. I said, so how is the company dealing with all these climatic changes? Because, you know, the seed companies are very aware that climate change is happening. It may not be the government, but I mean, the companies know this is happening. They work with farmers. They feel that. And actually, the first thing she said was, well, you know, we sent a whole bunch of people to the science march like a year ago. A bunch of scientists descended on Washington. And I thought that was interesting, defending climatic science. And anyway, her response was, we endeavor to separate the seed from the environment in which it's growing. Mm. That was like a pretty amazing sentence. That was like, I just kind of took that in and said, well, that pretty much encapsulates the approach that we're talking about and kind of losing the systems thinking that you're talking about, is this idea that we actually create another system, an alternative system, that's not reliant on the natural system, which is what's contained in the seed, what's contained in the soil, this interactive loop that I think the question refers to and you've been talking about, and tries to create an alternative system based on kind of chemical inputs and then reproduce that system kind of infinitely, basically, which pretty much captured that sense of the change that I think they're talking about. And I think the efforts now are going back to an earlier idea that there's enormous potential in the soil and in seeds that can actually have the capacity to grow and thrive.
You also have the challenge about the regionalization, because like when we were talking earlier, you said that kogi nut squash actually tastes different, a little bit different, depending on where it's grown.
Yeah, so I think that's a kind of a unique, I don't know, something unique about seeds is that it is not all about the seed. It's all about the seed in the way that it is expressed through the soil and in the environment. So I think that is both a challenge and an opportunity, however you look at it. But it is interesting that what we've seen more than anything is that there is no one standard for how these vegetables taste and even look, and that's something to celebrate maybe. But I think part of this participatory network is really to kind of collect an enormous amount of data around the country and to some extent around the world on how, again, these varieties are adapting so that we can share that information with the growers and have them make informed decisions in the fields, but also to see where we need to kind of invest resources in the future. And I think that there are certainly regions in the US that are kind of underserved by our modern seed industry, as they've moved away from regional seed companies to more of these one-size-fits-all models. There are regions that are kind of left behind in that negotiation. So I think a lot of our thinking right now is how do we kind of devote resources to some of those projects.
Could you imagine a database that people could contribute to share their learning? I mean, I know there's a global database that gardeners use to identify when things bloom in their garden, and they're using this in to track climate change, to see how the variations in when things are pollinating. And
yeah, absolutely. We have done some GIS mapping this year and kind of beginning to think about how we can not have all of the data just come to us, but how we, people can share it with one another, and how can we provide the tools to do that. So it's not something that we've activated yet, but it's a big part of our thinking is how do you make this to some extent kind of open source in that way, so that there's a lot of information sharing.
And there are these cool seed libraries that have been popping up all across the country, and they're just really cool. I went to the one in Richmond. If anybody goes to Richmond, I mean, there's a super cool seed library up there, and it's in the old public library, so it's in this great old building, and they took all the old card catalogs, which for my generation were where you found your books, and they stuck them in the back room when it went digital. Now they've taken them out, and the seeds are
Oh,
in them.
neat.
And people take them out for a season and then bring back with comments. So what you're just saying, this data collection. And I think that kind of thing is happening in many different places across. That's just one example.
Is Anne McElveen here tonight? Anne? Come on down, Anne. You know why we liked Mary McGrail's question so much? Anybody know? Because she connected two readings, two disparate readings.
Oh, yeah.
How are you, Anne? Tell us what you're studying, and you look familiar.
Hi. I am good. I'm studying environmental science, and I'm a senior. Okay. Let me pull up my question. Okay. Okay. So an interesting point raised in your book, Seeds of Resistance, is that the seeds stored in the refrigerators of native seed search are becoming increasingly valuable as the world starts to look more like the American Southwest. Native seed search is devoted to conserving the agro-biodiversity of the Southwest with an emphasis on preserving the cultural ties to the food. As the world changes and the seeds become more valuable, what do you think is the most ethical way to distribute ancestral foods? Do you think the seeds should be privatized, or should they be democratized, meaning they would be publicly available for breeders to reuse and build upon and potentially genetically engineer?
That is an awesome question. And it's huge. I mean, this is a huge,
Thank you.
such a huge and interesting and very topical question. So one of the things which you've identified and you picked up from my book, and which I learned in the process of doing this, is this, what the climatic stresses have led to is this search for responses to these increasing stresses. And one of the things that's been happening in a major way is people beginning to realize that native people, let's say in the American Southwest, have been growing food for thousands of years. The oldest domesticated agriculture is in kind of like New Mexico, Arizona. It goes back 4,000 or 5,000 years. And people there have been growing food in different stressful conditions over millennia. So there are many scientists, many farmers, many thinkers in this area who are going back to those kind of native approaches, which is why there is this kind of native seed bank in Tucson, which I recommend to anybody if you end up in Tucson. It's a very cool place. And I mean, the seed bank is. Tucson's also interesting. But as that occurs more and more, people growing more attentive to the incredible value in those seeds. And that is reproduced, by the way, all over the world. In the Amazon, they're coming up with new varieties that are very resilient and can be used for food, and different other places around the world. The question is, how do you get those more into circulation? So I think there are means to do this now. To recognize the indigenous cultivators is totally central. And so there are efforts to do this internationally. There's a Convention on Biological Diversity that has some mechanisms to try to recognize people on an international level. And it's complicated and it's not quite working very well, but it's conceptually there. But let's just stick with the United States for the moment. So in the Southwest, those seeds are extremely important. And I think that there needs to be a way to enable the cultivators to be compensated for several thousand years of having kept those varieties alive. The people who work with the oftentimes they work with if they're going to commercialize them, there needs to be some level of ownership of them. They're not going to be just donate. I mean, you have to make some kind of compensation. It's a business class, so you have to compensate the seed creators. What you're not going to do, though, is I think engineering them, which I think what you're saying is patenting them. There are ways to do new breeding. Number one, without engineering, we can't confuse seed breeding with genetic engineering. They're different things, and I think the efforts, which I'm not familiar yet with, but there could be happening, of big seed companies to use a native seed varieties and thereby and use that essential parental material to then engineer some offspring. That needs to be prevented from happening. And there are, technically, that's not supposed to happen, because if you go into a native seed store and buy seed, which you can go do if you want, and you work for a seed, but you can kind of maybe get away with some kind of version of that, but that needs to be challenged at every step. And that would be what I would say was, one, compensation, which is extremely important, and two, no genetic engineering, which is not happening yet. I'm not saying that is happening yet. So, but that's very important.
Do you?
Principle. Yeah, Charlotte, you might.
Sure.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Mark said, which is one, just to recognize the kind of incredible importance of that work. And as much as, Row 7 in our work is focused on the development of new diversity and new varieties, it totally depends on this reservoir of genetic resources and on these, these varieties that have been stewarded over thousands of years by these communities. So I think as we look forward in our work and see potential points of intersection there and where there might be overlap with some of that material, I think we're already thinking about how to be, how to share benefits and how to recognize those contributions, but also how to work with those communities that develop them to make sure that we are navigating that path in the right way, because I think they deserve to be participants in any conversation around the commercialization of a variety that utilizes that material. So I think we are looking toward projects like that in the future as hopefully as opportunities to create another platform for storytelling for the importance of their work and of maintaining it in the future. So.
And by the way, I think it's actually starting to happen already in the Southwest. You can go to Arizona and New Mexico, and you can, there's the native seed as a farm, and anyway, all around it, they've been working with Hopi and Tohomo O'odham communities, and they work on these tepary beans, which are like a native bean that's been grown for like thousands of years. They sell it now commercially in the South. It's delicious, it's crunchy, it's really nutty. And same thing with Sonora wheat, which is kind of a wheat that comes from that region. And you can get really good breads and pastas with this Sonora wheat, and they are done in conjunction in various forms of collaboration with native tribes in the Southwest, for example.
Well, thanks for your question, Anne. Anyone else have a question tonight for our guests? Come on down to the mic, please. We've got just a few more minutes, and then we have to do the fabled attendance. So I'm going to ask our, a concise question and concise answers.
Okay, so
Just introduce yourself real quickly. Thanks.
my name's David. I'm a junior in environmental economics and policy. And my question is mostly for Charlotte is, do you guys patent protect all your seeds that you're creating with companies?
Do we what, sorry?
Patent protect?
Oh.
Are you patenting them?
Yeah.
And I guess it kind of leads to the broader question of, like, if we're developing new seeds and varieties, and if they are these genetic resources that we so value, like, how do we deal with the patent protection concept? And I think this is related to the previous question, so.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you for asking. We do not patent protect any of these varieties, and we have pledged not to work with any material that is patented. So I think it comes down to that core value of, throughout history, people have depended on the improvement of our seeds, and patented material means that you can't utilize it for research and that growers can't save seed on their own farm. So it's creating this kind of roadblock to evolution. So we will not patent, and I think, I think part of the hope is that, in creating the cultural capital of a brand and of Row 7, that is, in a way, a kind of cultural, not patent, but a just kind of protection to the work that we're developing in the market. So,
Thank you. Well, we're going to check back with you on your second birthday because I think it's going to be intensely important also for row 7 to be able to maintain its independence. So it'd be something to maybe continue our conversation about how a small startup kind of, as we call, punches above its weight to have a outsized impact. So very inspiring. Thanks for coming all this way. And Mark, thanks for writing such a great book.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here tonight. If you're a student, take out your digital device, and Victoria will lead us in Kahoot to take roll. And if
Great talking with you. Go plant some good seeds.
yeah.
Alright, you guys know the drill. One quick note that if you notice that you're having problems with the Kahoot, it will save us all a lot of time if you just come up and chat with me right after this and give me your name really quickly instead of emailing me later. Yeah, but I'll let this go for a second. Okay, so a couple more people. So you guys said, I don't know, a few weeks ago that you were interested in learning more about alternative clean meat, lab-grown meat, whatever you want to call it. And so we will have a class that will involve that. But if you guys want to quickly give your answers. Do you guys need me to run it again because you didn't all get it? Yeah. Okie dokie. That's it. Thanks, everyone.